welcome to the talk show. It is my delight to have Nick Clegg here as our guest. And I suppose if I was going to summarize what he does, he takes difficult jobs. He was Deputy Prime Minister with a Conservative partner. He then went to Meta, where he had to deal with conversing between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. Not easy. We are talking here on almost exactly the 10th anniversary of Brexit, where he was a campaigner and a huge voice for staying in Europe. Since the 90s, he's worked in Europe. He was inside the European Union. And now he came out in order to fight for the cause in the referendum and also to explain why Europe should be our destiny. Nick Clegg, welcome.
Very nice to be here.
No, and let's talk about Brexit.
Sure.
It's 10 years.
Yeah.
And it failed, didn't it, the referendum?
Well, I'm sure the referendum won on the part of the victors, but of course it is worth recalling a decade since they won with a wafer-thin majority. I think one of the fundamental errors that the Brexiteers made, they took this wafer-thin mandate and interpreted it in the most hardline manner possible. I don't think very many people who voted for Brexit, in fact, I doubt they asked themselves, but I think many people who voted for Brexit didn't think that what they were handing to the Brexiteers was a mandate to behave as if they won 90% of the vote. It happened. The country was evenly split. And to take that mandate and then interpret such a hardline manner has, of course, meant that the Brexit we are now living with is even harsher than it would have been in other circumstances and even more self-defeating.
But put that in terms of what it's meant for the economy, what it's felt for our relationship with Europe. And you've spent a lot of time outside the UK in the last 10 years. What's the view from Europe and America as they look at the UK today?
Well, I think one of the things which is easy to forget is how indifferent great powers like America and China really are towards us. I mean, we're a great country, but we're a relatively small country in the grand scheme of things, floating off the muddy northwest fringes of Europe. And I find it very striking, looking back at my 7 odd years in Silicon Valley. I basically was never asked by the tech bros there very much about the United Kingdom at all. They would sometimes ask me what my views were on Harry and Meghan, which were then still remain one of basically overwhelming indifference. But I think we often in the debate, I think all countries do this, but perhaps most especially us Brits, because of our glorious and grand history, we somewhat overstate how important we are to others. And of course, that's one of the tragedies of Brexit, is its timing. We voted go it alone almost at exactly the inflection point in history when going it alone makes even less sense than it ever did as the world mutates into one of basically big power politics or big power rivalry between China and the US.
And the implications for the UK?
Well, the implications are we are poorer, we are weaker, less safe, and here's the great irony of ironies, and less sovereign. And that is the tragedy, is that those fibs from the Brexiteers that somehow we would take control has actually led to a decade where we have less control over our own destiny than in, I would argue, any time in the last several centuries.
So was Project Fear right?
Well,
as they termed it.
I think Project Fear about some economic consequences, unfortunately, has turned out to be more right than what was assumed at the time. And some of the most reliable recent estimates from the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, for instance, which is a pretty dispassionate and authoritative body, is that the damage to GDP is up anywhere between 6 and 8%. That is an enormous amount. That basically makes the economic or macroeconomic damage of Brexit pretty equivalent to the other great, terrible economic heart attack that we have suffered in the last decade or two, namely the 2008 financial shock. So we're almost unique in the world, which is why we're now in such an enfeebled state, to have had 2 massive economic sort of cardiac arrests, almost entirely unique to us. 2008 was pretty unique to us because the City of London, which is actually where we're sitting right now, plays such a disproportionate role in our national economy. And so the heart attack at the center of our banking system, really damaged us more than many other economies. And then, of course, 2016 was unique, damaging. Much of the rest of the world has had to deal with things like the COVID pandemic, the wars in Ukraine, now in Iran, and so on. But no other country has punched itself in the face quite so forcefully as we have done over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
So why did you fail to persuade the nation that it was the wrong thing to do?
Well, I'd like to take responsibility for a lot of things that I've done wrong, but I think on this occasion, even my staunchest critics, of which there are plenty around, I think would be, I hope, generous enough to admit that I wasn't really at the forefront of the referendum at all. I was very much against the idea, and if I'd been re-elected to government, I wouldn't have allowed the referendum to be held in the first place. And I was just
Although you were pro at one stage in having a referendum.
I was pro some years before the idea, which I think is a logical idea, which is that if a country pools a significant amount of constitutional power or decision-making power in a body like the European Union through a new treaty, that I think there was definitely a case to agree that new treaty, that new pooling of sovereignty by way of a referendum. The referendum that was held in 2016 was held for wholly different reasons, which I never agreed with, basically to manage the splits of the internal splits of the Conservative Party.
So do you blame David Cameron for that? I mean, it was his decision. He presumed he was going to win. He argued well, but unsuccessfully, that Brexit was going to be damaging, and he failed.
I certainly think it was a wholly unnecessary referendum. This is one of the things that the Brexiteers did very cleverly.
So was it for personal and party politics?
Of managing and I'm sure if you had David Cameron here, he'd make a very plausible account for why he felt it was in the national interest, but it was basically in the interest of the Conservative Party, and it was held because of the divisions within the Conservative Party. And the Brexiteers within the Conservative Party and within the press and so on very cleverly presented this as some great clamour from the British people. Here's the most interesting thing that history has already forgotten 10 years since it was held. Holding a referendum on Europe was barely in the top 10 of most people's preoccupations. If you look at the opinion polls at the time, the NHS, crime, jobs, the safety of your kids and all the rest of it came much, much higher than the somewhat crazed fascination by a wing of the Conservative Party, and now, of course, other further right parties about Europe. Most British people, I don't think they particularly loved the European Union.
But the majority did agree with the crazed
yes, absolutely.
view, as you put it.
Don't get me wrong. I think once that, but I was answering a slightly different question, which was this driven by some groundswell of public opinion to hold a referendum? Certainly, if you read the pages of the Daily Mail, you might think so. But actually, there was, and I know this as someone who'd been elected to working in elected office for 20 years, it was something that the political class and the media class obsessed about. But most normal people, I certainly don't think most normal people loved Brussels or the European Union. I suspect most normal people had a mildly Eurosceptic sort of view of things, but it wasn't top of their priorities. And that was the skill of the Brexiteers, as they got David Cameron and the leadership of the Conservative Party in effect over a barrel, where they felt they had no option but to concede to this long-standing demand of holding a referendum.
What does it make you feel when you see we are disconnected from this mass of other countries and the disadvantage you're talking about? Does it make you feel angry? Does it make you feel disappointed?
It's a mixture of intense sadness and real anger. I mean, anger at the industrial scale mendacity.
Tell me about that. Detail that to me.
Well, it's a fundamental lie to claim that you are going to be more in control of yourself by separating yourself off from your neighbours. That is a fundamental lie about how the modern world works.
But it was bought.
It was bought, but we'll come to the reason why it was bought. But you ask me why I'm angry. I'm angry about what, and I know that a lot of the people who propagated that lie were smart enough to know that it was. I mean, forget the lies of 350 million on the side of the bus. The fundamental assertion that you have more control over your own fate, that you can make your streets cleaner and safer, that you can produce better jobs for your kids, that you can produce more wealth to invest in our public services, that you can develop new technologies as technology evolves rapidly, that you can deal with criminal gangs which are trafficking people across the channel. All of those things are lies. We deal with all of those things better. This is the great irony. You say you secure more control over your own fate by working with others. And we either learn to accept that as a nation. We're not like China. We're not like the United States. We are not a continental-sized country. We're a great country, but we're 60, 70 odd million people with a great past. We are simply nowhere in the same league. I mean, nowhere near in the same league as the major powers that can sort of determine their own fate and can shape their own orbit. The only way that we can exercise real control over our modern environment, whether it's crime, whether it's safety, whether it's jobs, whether it's the economy, is by working with others. And it makes me very angry that the British people were lied to about that. And it makes me very sad that our kids and our grandkids won't have the opportunity now to be able to travel, to work, to study, to feel that their continent, I sometimes think that Brexiteers, they basically are seeking to overcome something which will never be overcome, and that is geography. Whether you like it or not, we're on this side of the Atlantic. We're not on that side of the Atlantic. We're not part of the United States. We are in Europe. We are tectonically and geologically always going to be in Europe. And it's as if the Brexiteers want to constantly perpetuate this sort of fable, this fairy tale, that somehow we can pretend that we're somehow nestled geographically next to Connecticut. We're not. We're right next to Belgium and the Netherlands. And we either accept our geographic destiny, and by the way, even when on things like trade, the biggest single determinant, certainly of trading goods, but also actually in trading services, somewhat different for investment, is where you are located. There is a reason why the Mexicans, the Canadians, always trade more with the United States than we will. There's a reason why we always trade more with Belgium or the Netherlands, or Luxembourg or France than the Canadians and the Mexicans will, because we live cheek by jowl next to them. And so I think this refusal to accept what our geography means for us has done profound damage to the country, and is a huge disservice, particularly to younger people.
How do we progress from here? You want a closer connection with Europe. What is the first step, the medium term, and what's the long-term result going to be?
So first, I think there are a whole bunch of things we can do, or any government can do, of whatever persuasion in this country, which I don't think are remotely politically controversial, which are not reliving all the horrors of the debates that people had in their communities and on their streets and amongst their families. I mean, we can clearly integrate more closely with Europe on defence. We desperately need to do so as the US increasingly pulls back from NATO in one way or another. We clearly try and work more closely with the Europeans on some of the cutting-edge technologies, which didn't exist 10 years ago. ChatGPT didn't exist. Starlink didn't exist 10 years ago. The world is completely different now to what it was 10 years ago. Clearly, we can't just be at the beck and call of Californian or Chinese.
Then what do we do to join it?
No, hang on, there's a separate thing. Then there's a domestic political issue. And here I think I suspect many people who are independent or vote for the Greens or Labour or the Dems, I think you need to be tough on yourself. There's no good just the left and the centre-left wanting to, get back into Europe or be closer to Europe. There's no reason why the Europeans should ever invest any political capital or burn any political capital on our account if there isn't some more meaningful cross-party consensus in favour of a rapprochement between the UK and Europe. So my own view is that in the long run, much as the departure of Europe ran through the centre-right of British politics, the rapprochement with Europe will have to run through the centre-right as well, which is why your previous interviewee sitting on this chair is so important. It's so important for people like John Major and Michael Heseltine, and Conservatives speak up. Because in the end, if the Conservatives want to be a party of business and want to be a party of the future and not the past, and want to be a party in favour of, or in the name of young people, not just old people, they're going to have to shift their position. So I think that is very...
But why do you think that the Lib Dems, which you led, and Labour on the left are not going to do what they say they do, or would like to happen, which is to be pro-Europe? Why does it have to be on the right side?
I'm saying that you're not going to get this country back into Europe unless we have more of a cross-party consensus than currently exists. And what we have at the moment is that the left, centre-left parties, Green, Labour and Lib Dems and parties in Edinburgh and Cardiff as well, are basically making increasingly assertive noises about the Lib Dems. I think quite rightly have said recently they want us to enjoy the single market and so on. My point is, if you're sitting in Paris or Berlin or Brussels, and remember what an utter drain it's been on their time and attention, this endless melodrama in the United Kingdom, this hokey-cokey, are we in, out? Remember, we first stayed out in the 1950s, then we tried to join, and de Gaulle rather loftily vetoed us. Then we went back in under Edward Heath. Then here's the great irony, it was under Margaret Thatcher that we created the single. Here's the irony, it's actually under Conservative leaders that this country both has entered into the European community historically, and then done the greatest act of pooling of sovereignty, which is the creation of the single market, which was this extraordinary alliance between Margaret Thatcher and Jacques Delors.
And the Daily Mail calling for us to join Europe when David English was editor.
All of that. But my point is, you can't ask the Europeans to cut us some slack, yet alone some counter spending years again, renegotiating all this again, if only one half of the political equation in the United Kingdom is in favour. Now, I think it's very important that that half, the pro-European half, should be more outspoken, because one thing we should have learned from the Brexiteers is even if you feel the case that you're making is not going to work out soon, you've got to start making early. And these things have a long run. And then the final, if I may, just the final part of my answer to your question is my own view is that our fate back in Europe in one shape or form will be very, very closely yoked to the fate of Ukraine. I think Ukraine will eventually, it'll be painful, but will eventually join the European Union, perhaps in some associate membership to begin with. And as Ukraine, and indeed other countries, are all lining up to join the European Union, whether it's Moldova or Iceland or Norway or I think the countries in the Balkans as well, I think as the European Union enlarges, and particularly as it accommodates Ukraine, I personally think it's unthinkable that Ukraine would be at the top table of decision-making in Europe, and we would not, given the amount of sweat and treasure and commitment we have quite rightly committed as a country to protect Ukraine's independence. And by the way, the European Union itself will be quite different to what it is today, quite different to what it was 10 years ago. I think it'll take probably another decade, but maybe what we should be doing as we reflect on the last lost decade is first sort of saying to each other, let's not lose another and another and another decade. We already lost one decade. Why don't we aspire, alongside Ukraine, to rejoin a changed and reformed European Union in a decade from today?
So take me through some of the simple things to make it attractive. Is it youth unemployment? Is it changing trade? Is it the customs union? What are some of the mechanisms which would be an attractive argument and are practicable to put into action?
You mean an argument, a modern argument?
For us to getting closer.
I think, well, first, I think the enduring underlying principle remains the same, strength in numbers. And I think that's only become more acute as the United States under Donald Trump has turned from being this sort of erstwhile alliance that we took for granted to being a real predatory threat to our way of life. And I think there are some people who believe that Donald Trump is a passing squall, that, once he goes, sweetness and light will be restored. I think that is a total fantasy. I think there's been a permanent shift in the body politic in the United States. That's certainly what I see.
Can you describe what that means?
Well, what that means is that there's close to half the voting public in the United States who are increasingly being encouraged by their leaders, their sort of MAGA leaders, to not just sort of look down on, but really have barely concealed contempt for Europe. If you listen to them publicly and privately, what Vance, Trump, what these sort of MAGA people say, they don't just think that Europe is whiny and weak and feeble, as, by the way, in many respects we unfortunately are compared to US, given the divergence in economic performance between the US and Europe over the last decade and a half. But they have real contempt for Europe.
And this comes from Trump?
I think it comes. I mean, look, every political movement that I've ever either been part of or observed, politics is a highly tribal business. And when you're in politics, your tribe often is glued together by having a sort of top three things that you love and top three things you hate. That's just the way that political tribes kind of organize themselves. And if you listen to MAGA people.
Keep on Trump. Just keep on Trump.
If you listen to Trump and the sort of MAGA tribe he leads, there's sort of three things really, and I saw this years before he was elected for a second time while I was working in Silicon Valley. The things they really hate are immigrants, particularly from Latin America, from Mexico, green energy, wind farms. They seem to have an absolute swivel-eyed obsession about against wind farms, and whiny Europeans. And I was present both at the Munich Security Conference and at the AI conference in Paris, weeks after Trump was elected, where Vance came and basically more or less declared war on the values that I think many mainstream Europeans hold dear, the rule of law, multilateralism, and so on and so forth. And this is my wider point, believe that is not a temporary shift. That is a permanent shift in the transatlantic relationship. It doesn't mean we shouldn't seek to have always very good, strong relationships with whoever's in the White House. But we shouldn't think that you can turn the clock back to a pre-Trump era, which prevailed for roughly 70 years since the Second World War. And that, to your question, means that we have a very profound question. If we're out of the European Union, we're out of the top councils of our own continent, and we can no longer rely on our traditional ally, the United States, we are alone. And if anyone thinks that being alone is a smart place to be in this modern world, they've got another thing coming.
Would you see America as our premier ally at the moment or not?
It's an incredibly important ally, but it is not the ally that it was. It is not an ally we can count on as much as we can before. And what that leads to is a very simple question, is how do we, as a much smaller country and a much weaker country, certainly compared to the US and China, how do we secure the safety and the prosperity that the British people deserve? And my simple point is, the very surefire way of not doing that is by cutting yourself from your nearest neighbours. That is why the timing of Brexit was almost so exquisitely tragic. It was a almost quixotic attempt to do things on our own, exactly at the point when the world took a turn. And when I think a lot of these Brexiteers assumed that we were going to have some marvellous new, trade deal with the US that was going to pay for everything. We didn't even have a particularly good trade deal. And the one that was there, this tech deal that Trump and Starmer, as I, by the way, privately predicted to the then UK ambassador to Washington, Peter Mandelson, I told him privately, I said, you shouldn't do this because this will fall to bits. And it'll fall to bits because the Americans don't need any of this deal.
That's nothing to do with Trump, because I had to take the decision as the principal decision maker at Meta at the time to suspend Trump from the use of Facebook for 2 years. I doubt if he's disinclined to listen to me, he's even more disinclined to listen to me after that.
And was that something you persuaded your boss to do, or your boss, Mark Zuckerberg, were?
But it was my decision.
And it was a decision, obviously, I shared with Mark Zuckerberg and the board of the company at the time. But it was just, it was not my decision. It wasn't just a quixotic decision I took on my own. There was a whole process and wider consultation and so on. But it was very clear to my mind at the time that Donald Trump's behavior around January the 6th transgressed or violated the content rules of Meta as they were at the time. By the way, I don't take that decision lightly, and I certainly don't sort of brandish it as any point of pride, because I remain, as a liberal, extremely uncomfortable by the idea that a private company basically, said to an elected official, that they were elected politician, they were not allowed to use their services. So it was a very, I'm not.
What was the specific which turned you to? What was the specific which made you say, Trump, you're fired from this platform?
The rules, the content rules, as I at least helped shape, presided over at the time, meant that you couldn't use
Facebook services to propagate content and circulate and distribute content which seemed to foment violence, or in this case, the suspension or disruption to the peaceful transfer of democratic power after an election. So look,
those are the reasons at the time. But you asked me whether I had met him. No, I haven't. I'm not going to start giving sort of grandiloquent message to the President of the United States. He's not going to listen to me. But my point is much more British focused. Trump is what he is. You can have your various opinions, but the reality, this is where the Brexiteers and the fantasists
who still believe that somehow we can regress to some gunboat diplomacy history where we could sort of ride the waves as some great naval nation and to hell with everybody else. It's just not the world we live in anymore. So I think there is a pro-European case, which oddly enough is much more forward-looking and much more in tune with the times than perhaps the case that was being made in 2016.
But then when you saw Meta and other social media companies and tech companies lean into Trump, suck up to Trump, if one's just being very straightforwardly observing what happened, what was your reaction from having the person who fired Trump from Meta to seeing them all?
Well, I mean, it was around that time, and no coincidence, that I announced I was leaving Silicon Valley and leaving Meta. Here's the great irony. In those discussions at the time, I was probably the only person who actually ever been elected to anything. And I was probably the most forthright voice who said, not because of my own politics or anything, I wasn't there as a Lib Dem, I'd left politics behind a long time ago, but because I just don't think it makes business sense to jump into bed with one sort of political tribe or another. Why? Because one thing I know from quite a long time in my own career in politics is the pendulum always swings. So what are these guys going to do when and if there's a Democrat president? Are they then going to turn up at their inauguration and say they agree with everything that she or he says? I just don't think it makes sense as a matter of business principle to embark on this whole whiplash.
I get the practicality, but we're talking about principle as in principle.
Well, it is actually a principle. I don't think it is a practicality. I think particularly if you're dealing with something as important as human speech, which is what of course social media is about, it's all the more important that you remain at arm's length from politics. So I don't think that's a practical issue. I think it's actually an issue of kind of quite important principle in terms of the division of labor between these companies that provide us with the modern kind of public square for debate and for content and for communication. I think it's all the more important. They're not making widgets, they're not making pot plants. They're dealing with probably the most controversial thing of all, which is what we say and how we express ourselves. And I think for that reason it is always better. And by the way, that was always the tradition. When I arrived in Silicon Valley in the autumn of 2018, Silicon Valley was still very much then driven by that culture of deep skepticism about politics. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why Silicon Valley, for those who visited it or studied it, did so well in California, precisely because it was so far away from DC. It was the other side of the American continent. It looked out on the Pacific, not the Atlantic. It was sort of the Grateful Dead and long-haired bros surfing. It was just a completely different culture. It was quite a libertarian culture, but it was definitely a very anti-politics culture. So oddly enough, I found myself as a Brit in this highly kind of American culture, oddly enough, speaking up for a long-standing Silicon Valley principle, which is tech bros stay out of politics. And I think it will be proven to be a mistake for these tech bros to get so ensnared with entangled with politics.
In a funny way, the way you described the Grateful Dead and the sort of slightly liberal element of Silicon, that is also politics. Wasn't it the fact that they were going towards the right, that it was becoming a hardline Republican? Isn't that really the objection for you?
I actually genuinely think I would have had not a dissimilar reaction if I felt all of the tech bros were going to turn up at the inauguration of
But it would have been less noticeable and less.
Of course, it's less noticeable because Trump is a uniquely controversial and polarizing figure, and of course what he represents is almost the polar opposite of what I personally believe. But you're asking me about my own reactions and advice, not when I was a Liberal Democrat leader, but when I was, as it turned out, probably one of the most senior European executive in one of these big tech companies. But my point to you is, here's the great irony. If you speak to a lot of these sort of tech guys in Silicon Valley and you say, why are you spending all your time beating a path down to Mar-a-Lago? Why are you cavorting in the White House and falling over yourselves to, in this sort of public display of obsequiousness towards Trump and so on? And what they'll say to you privately, and they say it publicly as well, is they'll say, we may or may not like it. And by the way, a lot of them were formerly Democrat donors, Sergey Brin from Google and others. And they'll say the reason they flipped their switch as much as they have and are so pro-MAGA now is partly because they think that, they don't want to be outflanked by their own competitors. So they don't want one of their competitors to cut a deal with this very transactional administration. So they think if their competitor is in the room, they want to be there as well. So it's a kind of form of FOMO. They also want to be in good odor with this administration so that they can enlist the services of the administration to biff the noses of perfidious regulators in Brussels and London and elsewhere. But what they often say to you is they'll say, look, the world has changed. Our whole world is now driven by this existential battle between China and America. And if we Americans are going to win the battle for AI supremacy against China, we have to have Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. working hand in glove, in harness. And here's the great irony. In doing that, in conflating tech power and political power, the American elite is now behaving more in a Chinese way than they were previously. Previously, of course, they always used to criticize the Chinese for having, no sort of state and church separation between the private sector and political power. And now you've got this extraordinary display of the Trump administration saying they want to take a public stake in these companies, withholding access to some of these AI models, so behaving in an incredibly interventionist way, and in a way that even the most sort of fiddly bureaucrat in Brussels would never dare be as dirigiste as they are. So it's a great irony, it seems to me, that the Americans in trying to measure up against the Chinese are almost, perhaps unwittingly, emulating the conflation of tech and political power that you see in China.
And was there a sense of personal not wanting to tolerate that moral softness for you? I mean,
I just didn't want to be part of it because I couldn't be helpful even if I wanted to be part of it because I just didn't. So you might have been. I'm a very sort of practical person. I just like I had 7 years in Silicon Valley, very happy years, fascinating work. I'll be forever grateful for having had the opportunity. But the world around me certainly changed considerably, and I certainly
and your fortunes changed. Very well paid. It was a whole new projection into the most capitalist of countries and companies.
Yeah, of course. Look, listen, I've worked in my life in basically 3 bubbles. I worked for 10 years in Brussels, 12 years in Westminster as an MP, and 7 years in Silicon Valley. And what I discovered is, you work in a media bubble, all bubbles are the same. Everybody in those bubbles think they're the most important place in the world, and they think that the rest of the world is constantly talking about them. By the way, of the bubbles I've worked in, the most self-regarding and probably most deluded was Westminster. Because Westminster still thinks it's somehow the centre of the universe, sort of ludicrously enough. But so Silicon Valley had all those features that these bubbles do, of self-importance, pomposity, of feeling. But guess what? They do so happen to be kind of at the centre of a lot of things because they are inventing world-transforming technologies. And I work for a company, for instance, for 4 billion human beings, whether you like or loathe these companies, and many people feel sharply polarizing emotions about them. Billions of people are using these technologies. So I often think for people who say, oh, you shouldn't have anything to do with them, it's like, you can't ignore a fact like billions of people using a technology. Not engaging with that, in my view, is not an option. I mean, it might make you feel maybe more high-minded, but in my view, it's always important to try and, which is why, as you say, I probably have taken up jobs which are controversial and gnarly, because I believe dealing with reality as you find it. One thing which I think is unambiguously the case is that these technologies, and this is only being exacerbated by generative AI, because it's so incredibly expensive to build these things. It's actually a monstrously inefficient technology. You require billions of dollars to build these data centers and so on, is that these technologies are now in the hands of a tiny, vanishingly small number of people. Basically a handful of tech bros in Silicon Valley and a handful of tech bros, they are all tech bros, in China too. And I think that concentration of unelected power is a real issue, is a real problem. And I think it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem. And I think the backlash against tech is only going to grow. The more that these technologies, the AI, or the latest manifestations of this AI technology that infuse our everyday lives. So I think there's a real, I tried when I was in Silicon Valley to kind of make that power more accountable. I helped create an oversight board at Meta. I brought in researchers. I tried to, I welcomed rather than rejected regulation, et cetera, But I think a lot of this, and the reason why people rightly feel a lot of unease about these technologies, is there's a huge amount of power.
So this is going from bros to Big Brother.
Yeah, that's quite a good phrase.
Yeah. And do you feel that is going to be something which will probably alarm us and may control us and may alter our destiny?
I just think you have to look at the kind of fundamental physics of this technology. It's so expensive that only a tiny number,
Well, governments can afford it.
I'll give you an example of what we're now dealing with. The top, 6, 7 US so-called hyperscalers, that's the big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Google, and so on, are now spending just on AI data infrastructure, data centers, and so on, every 6 to 7 weeks, actually every 5 to 6 weeks, what we as a nation spend on defense in a year. And they're doing that every 5 to 6 weeks. I cannot exaggerate to you how almost Lilliputian we are compared to what these big companies are building in China and America, which is why, of course, I think it's wonderful that we've got this very vibrant science and university base in this country. We've got very vibrant startup scene, which I'm very involved in myself now as an investor in a venture capital fund that I'm involved in. But this is an era where scale and size really, really matter. This isn't a technology which lends itself to being easily democratized. It actually lends itself to ever greater concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of people. And if those people, in Musk's case, want to also interfere in our election and or want to aid and abet politicians who want to disrupt our democracy, that is really worrisome, because that is a degree of power and might which is ranged against us, which we need to be very clear-eyed what we're sort of up against. And my message to people who still believe that somehow going it alone is a viable strategy is, in that kind of context, the idea that, plucky Britain is going to be able to kind of punch above its weight in that awfully overused phrase is a fantasy. It's a fantasy. We're only as strong as we are together with others.
Which is why we need to join Europe.
In my view, one of the things we absolutely look. I always explain this to people. If you believe in that sort of very journalistic phrase that we're in a new industrial revolution, whether we are or not, and that data is the new oil. Terrible analogy, by the way. It's about almost the opposite to oil, but never mind. It's the thing that everyone keeps saying. Let's just go with that for a while. So we're in a new industrial revolution. Let's be clear. We don't have a single steam engine of our own. And that is the equivalent of what we're doing. It's like going into the Industrial Revolution, which we as Brits pioneered, without a single steam engine of our own. We have lots of ingenious companies. We do great things in certain other areas, biomedical science, quantum, and so on. But in terms of the building blocks of this technology, which they're called foundation models, and you have to so-called train these foundation models. No one in their right mind would train a foundation model in this country because energy prices are too high and because there's just a huge amount of ambivalence and ambiguity about who owns the data and so on. And I just think I don't think it serves our national interest in ducking from the gravity of what we're facing. We're facing a world which will be entirely dominated by a technological battle between China and the United States where we have no dog in the fight at all. And unless we create that scale and that size that matters, which we can only do in our own hemisphere and in Europe.
Will that happen, and how is it going to happen?
Well, I don't think it's happening nearly urgent enough. I spend some of my time, I'm actually in Brussels later this week, trying to urge to privately European decision makers and others to take the steps necessary.
Do they want us?
That's a slightly different thing. You ask about can we become the sum of our parts technologically?
Yes.
Can we develop these steam engines? Can we develop proper tech champions? Well, not if we don't act as the sum of our parts. And that's what Europe as a whole and we are failing to do. And I think there are some people who recognize that things need to shift. I think if you look at this famous report produced by Mario Draghi over a year ago now, I think his diagnosis is not flawless, but is pretty compelling. He has 400 recommendations there. And guess what? Over a year later, I think less than 10% of those recommendations have been implemented. So I think there is just a chronic lack of urgency. There's just this lack of urgency about how quickly we could be consigned to museum status in Europe and Britain by this China. I mean, if you go to Silicon Valley today, or you go to the equivalent in China, the pace of change is breathtaking. We're not even in the same league. We're not even in the same galaxy. And so I think what I find so frustrating is we are where we are. We're at 10 years since Brexit. It's clearly done us an immense amount of damage. The vast majority of British people know that it was a mistake. The vast majority of younger people passionately know it's a mistake and want in some way or another to be plugged back into the European continent. And yet, this lack of urgency really, really worries. I mean, Andy Burnham gave a speech, this great speech about the future of Britain. He didn't mention artificial intelligence. How can you give a speech in the era of AI? It's like someone giving a speech, I don't know what the historical equivalent is, in the 1870s or 1880s, and not mentioning factories. It almost all
electricity.
Well, exactly. I'm going to probably get my history wrong. So I just think we have to be a lot more tough on ourselves about what we're up against, and much more urgent in taking remedial action.
No, fascinating. I just want to bring you, famously, you were the partner of David Cameron in a coalition government. When you now look at the Tories which had followed since him, from Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and you look at the Tories of the previous era and Cameron himself, do you think and we've got Kemi Badenoch at the moment, do you think the quality and the persuasiveness has just diminished year by year?
Oh, I think the Conservative is clearly it's just a shadow of its former self. And by the way, there's one, I think...
Give me some reasons for that.
I was about to. I think one of the principal reasons is the Conservative Party, for almost generations, occupied an almost unrivaled position in British politics of being, actually pragmatic, rather than sort of mad and ideological, which is a good thing. And it's the whole sort of Burkean tradition, being sceptical and grand plans and blueprints and so on. They've lost that. But secondly, always being the reliable voice, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, but the reliable voice of private enterprise, of wealth generation, of entrepreneurship. And I find it very, very striking. The Conservative Party has completely forfeited that because of Brexit. I mean, they are architects of possibly the greatest act of economic self-harm. And by the way, in the name of removing red tape, they have suffocated our exporters in red tape. So they forfeited the right to speak on behalf of private enterprise, wealth generation. And here's the great irony. No one else has really stepped into that. That's what I find odd, is exactly the time when everyone bleats constantly about growth. There doesn't really actually seem to be any political party that viscerally understands how you create wealth. And it's not governments. It's not moving an office up to a suburb of Manchester. It is actually rewarding risk takers and people who are prepared to really put their neck and their money and their reputations online to build businesses, create new jobs, and so on. And it's very odd, that Reform is not interested in that. They're interested in culture wars. The Conservatives have forfeited their right to do that. Labour and the Liberal Democrats in different ways sort of kind of talk about it, but maybe not with the conviction that they should. So I think and I say this, by the way, as someone who fought Conservatives all my life, but then, of course, both fought and worked with them in coalition in equal measure. I think the country really misses a party that speaks for wealth creators, because we're not going to get out of this hole. We've just today heard from the fiscal watchdog that our fiscal position is even more perilous than we thought it was. It's almost we're almost uniquely vulnerable to fiscal shocks amongst countries in the developed world. None of that gets dealt with unless we generate more wealth, and you don't do that by just constantly repeating the word growth or saying that devolution is a magic wand which will solve everything. It clearly won't. And that's where I think, actually, historically, the death of the once great Conservative Party is so keenly felt by this country, because we don't really have any major persuasive proponents in favour of how to create wealth, generate new jobs, generate new ideas. There are parts of the British economy society that are incredibly growth oriented. So if you look at sort of small tech startups, people with a new software idea or a new AI idea or something, we have incredibly vibrant people.
I'm talking about politics.
Well, you might about the society as a whole, I thought. And so I think there are great entrepreneurs and there are great risk takers. And actually, we've got, not least because of reforms introduced by David Cameron, myself, and the coalition, a much, much more vibrant startup culture and venture capital culture and risk taking culture, certainly in that sector. But in general terms, when I look back at my time in politics, I was Deputy Prime Minister for 5 years. That coalition government, I mean, irony of ironies, it was a government composed of two parties that lasted for half a decade, infinitely longer than every single party government since then of both other parties. But we did actually, I keep hearing Labour politicians in particular saying there's been no growth since 2010. That's just not true. From about the middle of 2012 to the Brexit vote, the British economy consistently regularly grew faster than any other G7 economy. And in the last full year of the coalition, 2015, our growth rate was almost 3%. It was higher than annual growth rate was higher than the United States. It's almost unthinkable now. Now, there was clearly the country was still carrying deep scars from 2008. Productivity was still pretty flat, real terms. Wages only just started recovering and were then again slapped back after Brexit. But the point is, when I look back on that, what do I think we did? I mean, governments don't invent growth, but you could help foster the conditions for growth. And I think some of the things we did are, of course, the circumstances are very different. I don't want to pretend they're similar, but they are still relatively, appropriate for governments these days. Don't keep chopping and changing politically. Political stability is good for growth because it allows people to plan. We kept ministers in place longer than any other government since then. Keep taxes on entrepreneurship and risk-taking low. Don't add new costs to employers in terms of hiring and firing people. Keep your trade relationships with your main trading partners open and more open if you can. These are some basic things that we did. They're not rockets. I mean, they're clearly difficult to do because they haven't been done since then. But the interesting thing when you look at the Labour government since they came into power a couple of years ago is they've done almost the reverse on all of that. They've loaded more costs on employers, more taxes on wealth creators. They've indulged in just as much political instability as their Conservative governments which came before them. They've got to learn some of the basic principles about how governments governments don't invent. I sometimes felt with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, they were sort of typical Labour politicians who say, well, I've given a speech on a Tuesday in Whitehall saying there shall be growth. Why is there no growth by Thursday? It's like politicians don't invent growth by pontificating about it, but they can create the conditions in which people who do take risks and invest money and create jobs are encouraged to do so.
Andy Burnham is talking about hope and growth and transparency. He's about to become Prime Minister. Do you know him? Do you have any view on him?
Look, no, I think I've met him a couple of times. Don't know him well. I have not seen any evidence from him so far, and I hope I'm wrong. Not because I'm a great fan of him or the Labour Party, because I'm a great fan of this country, and anyone who cares about this country has got to acknowledge that this is probably the last chance we have for a government to deliver the prosperity the country deserves before a more populist reaction takes over our politics. In one sense, I think all of us should want him to succeed. But so far, I've heard nothing. I mean, literally nothing from Andy Burnham that suggests to me that he really understands the visceral animal spirits that animate a thriving, growing private sector economy. And I'm all for devolution. Devolution is fine. Devolution does not in and of itself create growth. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that devolved administration preside over low rates of growth. It's maybe a good thing to do in and of itself, but it is absolutely not the answer to our central dilemma, which is that we have a private sector that feels overburdened, overregulated, overtaxed, and misunderstood by this government. That is what Burnham needs to change.
Nick Clegg, you are a politician who's...
No, I'm not. I'm an ex-politician.
Ex-politician. Well, you're
Very ex,
you're
very
you're
ex.
you're you're a figure who's been in Silicon Valley. You've been in Westminster. You've been in Brussels, and you've given us, to use a European phrase, right, tour d'horizon of the landscape across the globe, heading from Britain to China to Russia, but mainly to the heart of Europe. Thank you very much
Thank you.
indeed.
Thank you.